It's a recording. Well, welcome. I'm Jen Rowe from the City of Boston. I am here to call the meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee to order. I will go through and read some of our notices. Feel free to continue your lunch if you would like. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. And our meeting guidelines. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After participants can mute and unmute themselves, please always do remain muted unless you're actively speaking. And to participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find this either by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raise hand function, or in the reactions button in the toolbar. I, as chair, will then call on participants. If you're on a phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. Of course, if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Erin McGuire via the chat box or at emaguire@ctps.org, or the phone number 857-702-3681. This meeting is being recorded. It's accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom clients are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Erin McGuire and via the chat box, and Erin's email is emaguire@ctps.org, or again, 857-702-3681. Thank you. So again, my name is Jen Rowe with the City of Boston. I believe that Ethan is going to call the roll today.
Yes, thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me just toggle over real quick to my roll call sheet there. Sorry for the delay there. MassDOT Seat 1, Office of Transportation Planning.
Yep, Derek Gravatt here from Mass.OTP.
MassDOT Seat 2, Highway Division and Project Management. I don't know if John Bouchard is in the meeting. Moving on, Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Good afternoon, Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Jenkins Advisory Council here.
Town of Brookline.
Erin Chute, Town of Brookline's here.
Town of Arlington.
John Alessi, Town of Arlington.
Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
This is Brad Rawson, representing Somerville and Inner Core. Thanks, everybody.
And Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giabetti, Metro West.
Right, and we heard from Kristen Guichard from Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton, that she will not be able to make today's meeting. So I believe that is all for the roll. And I do see Jen's comment in the chat that John Bouchard may be joining us later.
Yep. Said he was going to try to make the TIP project readiness portion. Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll start off with an opportunity for public comment. A member of the public wish to comment? See, Christina Johnson.
Hi, thank you very much. For the record, my name is Christina Johnson. I am the Director of Planning and Community Development for the Town of Hudson. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I just wanted to offer first a thank you and a brief comment, and this is relative to the design pilot program that was put forth by the Boston MPO to help municipalities like myself, like Hudson, advance our projects through the design process so that we can get into the TIP programming process. And currently, the town of Hudson is in the process of advancing another rail trail. This is our second rail trail adventure. We currently have the Assabet River Rail Trail, and we are now in the midst of connecting to the Mass Central Rail Trail, the first component in Hudson, which is already being advanced through the Eversource Transmission Line project. We received a grant from the Department of Conservation and Recreation for $119,000. That will be funding the preliminary work necessary to begin the full design process. As you all know, the design process usually falls on the municipality, and in this current economic climate is becoming increasingly more difficult for municipalities to basically go through the town meeting process and receive an appropriation. So many thanks to the MPO for putting together this design pilot program to help communities like Hudson advance design efforts, especially for rail trails, which is a Commonwealth priority as well as a priority of the board. And the town of Hudson submitted an application to begin the design process, 25% all the way to 100% PS&E for the next segment of the rail trail, the Mass Central Rail Trail, which, by the way, will connect us all the way to Waltham. This is pretty incredible. And we also received a significant match or a significant financial contribution from our Community Preservation Committee in the amount of $200,000, which is not insignificant for a small town like Hudson. And it has come to our attention that there's some consideration for including some of these design pilot programs into the TIP, as there seems to be some, based on the presentation I heard earlier, some project readiness issues with others. And I will tell you that Hudson is ready to go with the design process. The Deputy Director of Planning and Community Development, who's also the project manager, is on the Zoom if you have any specific questions related to this project. The town of Hudson, we are experts in getting rail trails designed and constructed, and it would be a worthwhile investment. So I would urge the MPO to consider the town of Hudson as well as a lot of the other design pilot applications, because it is such an asset to municipalities to be able to have that funding support from the MPO to advance these projects. Thank you so much for your time and your consideration.
Thank you so much for joining us, and for sharing about the project, and being engaged in the process. Over to Eric.
Yeah, just real quick. And Christina, thank you so much for that update. What is the request, the amount? I just wanted to include it for my notes.
It's just under $1 million. It's about 900,000 to begin the next segment, and all of that is outlined in our application. Great. But again, the town of Hudson has put forward a significant financial contribution from our CPC, who unanimously voted to support contributing $200,000 towards this application.
Thank you. I see J.R. Frey. Hang on.
Thank you for acknowledging me. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of Hingham in support of the Hingham Route 3A improvement project. As I mentioned in the prior meeting, which I believe nearly everyone, if not everyone, was on, we have advanced the 75% design. We have already engaged with our local permitting authorities to make sure that they have an understanding of the project well ahead of any submitted permit. And we believe that that's going to really improve the general acceptance of that project within those permitting entities by being able to incorporate some of their requests ahead of time prior to 100% submission. We are also, I will say, on the right-of-way end of things, the private property impacts on our project, we've taken very special care to minimize those. And the larger impacts are to existing municipal properties within the project alignment that the town will be maintaining in perpetuity. So we're going to re-engage with our MassDOT project manager and work closely with them to make sure that they are in agreement with us that Hingham's project is really ready to go and on track for a 2025 tip. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, definitely appreciate all the work that goes into that, and certainly would help us in our programming. So yeah, any other members of the public who would like to make comment before we launch into the agenda? All right, seeing none, we'll pass it over to Ethan to introduce the vote to approve the meeting summary.
Thank you, Jen. This is a request for a vote to approve the meeting minutes for our kickoff meeting from October 19th, 2023. I believe on the original agenda we had posted, we may have also put down the December 14th minutes. We were not able to get those posted 48 hours in advance of this, so we apologize. Those will be slated for a later meeting. So we're just looking for a motion to approve, or if folks have any questions on the minutes, happy to field them.
Thank you, Ethan. Do I have a motion to approve? Eric.
I'll make a motion to approve the October 19th meeting summary.
Fantastic. John Alessi.
I will second that motion.
Fantastic. Ethan, are you
Yep, I'll call.
you can do the roll? Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. MassDOT C1. Director Bob.
Yes.
I see that John Bouchard has joined us, so MassDOT Seat 2, Highway Division, John Bouchard.
If I'm seat 2 on this committee, then I say yes.
Okay. Metropolitan Area Planning Council, Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council, Len Diggins.
Diggins, yes.
Town of Brookline, Aaron Shute. I'll move on. Town of Arlington, John Alessi. We'll go back to Aaron in a bit.
John Alessi, yes.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville, Brad Rawson.
Brad Rawson, yes.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giametti, yes.
All right, and I think Aaron may have actually left the meeting, maybe due to some technical difficulties, so I believe that passes. I think that brings us on to the next item.
Thank you. So our next item, again, back to you, Ethan, on kind of draft tip scoring update.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So first off, again, as I said at the start of the meeting, thank you all, especially those of you who were also here with us during the MPO board meeting earlier, where I discussed the tip readiness updates, for joining us this afternoon. If we can go on to the next slide, the purpose of this very brief overview is to kind of do some housekeeping and provide a recap of some of the recent meetings that we've had, namely the December 14th TIP committee meeting. For those of you who may have been in attendance there or just looking for a summary, at that meeting, we were really focusing on the contents of the one line item in TIP Amendment 3 for federal fiscal years 24 to 28, which was microtransit funding and operating experiences as presented by the city of Newton in context of their Noon in Motion microtransit service. We also used that as an opportunity to frame how other microtransit pilots the MPO is operating have fared during their pilot programs and some of the successes or limitations that have been witnessed through much of those operations, and also the bearing that those challenges have on the rest of the Community Connections program. We also give a brief overview on the TIP universe of projects under consideration for funding at times for the 2025-29 TIP, and an overview of trends in the project design pilot as well. If we can go on to the next slide. So for the next meeting, given, oh, can we go back one? I thought I may have had a, I thought I had a different slide here. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, so this is actually a joint line item. I apologize. if we can go on to the next slide, sorry for jostling you around there, Aaron. One of the items to consider, especially in light of this morning's presentation on project readiness updates, is that given the complexities not only of the projects and the new programs that the MPO is considering for 25-29, including the project design pilot and the new transit transformation programs, and also all of those existing project readiness updates, we are looking to hold potentially 2 March meetings of this committee. The timeline shown below in blue shows where the MPO board meetings would happen, and in green where these committee meetings would happen. So unlike today, where there is a committee meeting after the MPO board meeting, these would happen on and off weeks, with March 7th being an MPO board meeting to discuss the final project scores for projects under consideration for federal fiscal years 25-29, March 14th potentially being a TIP process readiness and engagement committee to discuss not only scenario strategies and priorities, but also the disparate impact and disproportionate burden analyses that are conducted on the TIP from our equity program manager, Betsy Harvey. March 21st, a discussion of the MPO board to discuss and vote on preliminary scenarios. And March 28th, which is tentatively a second meeting, a refinement of preliminary project scenarios to reflect member priorities for this committee and also the greater MPO board. But on April 4th, MPO board members would select a final scenario. I mention this because we recognize that at the very start of this committee meeting, that one of the commitments that was made was that a meeting would likely be held every other month rather than twice in 1 month. However, given the season, we are asking and looking for feedback as to how receptive members would be to having 2 meetings in March, recognizing that this is in addition to the 2 weeks of MPO board meetings to discuss these topics as well. I can also say that while we don't have dates set yet, it is very unlikely that we would have another committee meeting until likely either June or July after this. So we would take a couple months of break afterwards. With that, I think if we go on to the next slide, should just be like a little discussion. Oh, and just after what I just said there too, the March 28th meeting, in addition to tentatively being the second, may not be a full-length meeting depending on how scenario discussions on March 14th go. Then I think the next one just says discussion because I'm open to feedback or comments on the possibility of having 2 meetings in March.
So much, Ethan. I see Eric has his hand raised.
What time are we thinking? Also 1 o'clock?
Also sticking with 1 o'clock, I believe, while these are still off weeks.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with that. I think we've got a lot of work to do with this tip. This is a big hole, and I think having some additional conversation, opportunity to hear about projects and the details of projects. I think the reason we created this committee, honestly, was in response to this problem, which is projects go up in cost, they get pushed out, readiness, and we have holes, and we don't have enough time to talk about what could fill those holes or what's happening to those projects, or are we going to take projects off the tip? Are we going to, why are we moving some projects and maybe not others? And I think having more time for that conversation is really important. And I would really encourage us to have these meetings, and they might need to be, more than an hour meeting. And I think learning more about what I really want to avoid is the day of the meeting where we're under the pressure to make the vote, where we're learning about new projects that we've never heard about before. We did that in the past, and I think that's a horrible process that we don't want to do again.
Thank you. Len.
Yeah, well, I agree with Eric. Although the notion, I think some of our colleagues who aren't on this committee, are going to be hearing about these situations for the first time. So we'll think about how we have to deal with that. And I can understand too the desire to have a longer meeting. I'm fine with that too. But I would respectfully request, and I know this, you may say no to this, and this is fine, is that we maybe move public comment to the end of the meeting, especially if it's open-ended. If we're going to have it at the beginning, maybe we could set a limit to it. What we've sometimes done, not we, but other groups, is that we have a limited beginning open public period and then public comment period, and then we have an open-ended one towards the end. That way you can predictably move through the agenda and also then request people who want to make public comment, to submit them, electronically or however beforehand, so that we are more aware of them beforehand. We're not trying to stop public engagement by no means, but at the same time, we have to have, I think, some sense of how long a meeting is going to last, so that those of us who have to do other things can do them. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Definitely hear that. And yeah, let's, unless staff has any immediate kind of responses, I think that we can take that under consideration for the next meeting. Also just add that perhaps I think also some clarification around, like the types of public, obviously anyone is welcome to make any type of public comment at any of, in the different venues, but that I think comments specifically advocating for projects are probably best heard by the entire MPO board. So maybe we can better about communicating that as well. Any other kind of questions or comments on this item? If none, I think I don't think there's a specific vote to be had here, but I think we'll take a absence of comment as a general okayness with what Eric and Len have suggested in terms of a mandate to continue on with the scheduling these meetings.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We'll make note of that, and then we will also put on the calendar 2 holds for time on the 14th and the 28th to meet. I believe we will stick to about an hour and a half, so likely 1 to 2:30 p.m. for each of those. But with that, I think we could, yeah. Sorry.
Move on to the next agenda item, yeah.
All right, so just another quick brief scoring update before we get into the weeds on tip readiness. So if we can go on to the next slide. As mentioned previously, so this is a cut down version, I should note, of a presentation that was provided to the Regional Transportation Advisory Council yesterday on February 14th to provide a very high level overview on how scoring is going for projects in the fiscal 25-29 tip before we talk about it in more detail on March 7th. So as of today, staff have received 29 formal project applications, and there is currently a 30th project still in development. Of those 30 projects, 10 are for community connections and 15 are for the project design pilot. The core investment programs, which is a term that I use to refer to the investment programs that represent the bulk of the MPO's regional target funding, the complete streets, the bike ped, the intersection improvements, and the major infrastructure programs, only represent 4 projects. Transit transformation represents 1 project received right now. If we can go on to the next slide, we can kind of break this down into more detail and show this on an investment programs basis for the design pilot and also the construction projects. So between the 15 design pilot and the 4 construction projects, 5 of those projects are in the bike and ped program, with 4 under design and 1 for construction as far as where applications lie. The complete streets program has 10 projects with a similar spread, 8 for design and 2 for construction. So about 80% design, 20% construction there, just with bike ped. And somewhat similarly, intersection improvements has 3 design project requests and 1 request for a construction project as well. For the community connections program on the next slide, given that the community connections program contains multiple different investment types, the purpose of this slide is to break out what those types are. So we do have 1 bicycle lanes project, which is actually the first time that that MPO staff have received a request to paint bike lanes through the community connections program. We also have 3 bicycle racks projects, which combined between the 3 of them represent the largest amount of bicycle rack procurement that we've also ever received a request for. We have 5 bike share support projects, thanks to the new adoption of the bike share support line item, 4 of which are requesting funding for replacement, which is new to this tip cycle, and we have 1 expansion project under evaluation as well there. And we also have recently obtained an application for 1 microtransit pilot project as well there. So again, this is just a very high level overview. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the readiness spreadsheet we're about to go into, you can see each of those projects in the blue highlighted rows on that spreadsheet, but we do not yet have scores for them. If we go on to the next slide, Scoring remains underway, and many applications still require some additional detail from the applicants in order to score them fully. Most of those are in the Community Connections program. And as the Readiness Days indicated, we are expecting some fill-in projects for federal fiscal years 2025 and 2026. We have expressed to potential project proponents that might be looking for fill-ins that they should submit those projects no later than the end of February. That way there's sufficient time for MPO staff to review them, potentially put a very draft score on them before presenting those scores to members at the March 7th meeting, or if not then, March 14th at that TIP committee meeting as well. We also hope to have draft scores sent to project applicants on this tomorrow, February 16th, though some applicants may wait longer to receive scores, depending on if additional materials are required there. And again, final scores will be presented on March 7th. So just some questions to consider here before we go into discussion, or if folks have any questions there on the next slide. I mentioned that we have tentatively been telling potential project proponents to submit projects no later than the end of February. We just want to confirm what members thought would be the latest date that they think fill-in projects could be provided in order to make sure that they would have enough time to consider those projects, and also what level of detail would be sought there, the same as any other application as we would normally solicit in November, or less so given time constraints. And then also to inform the readiness discussion we're about to have, what existing projects, if any, should members ask to be rescored for consideration? Now, we can go into that in more detail after we run through the readiness presentation, because it is different from what I showed this morning, but it's just something to consider going forward for the remainder of this meeting, especially because I'll just flag too, we did adopt new scoring criteria for this TIP evaluation cycle. So for some projects that may have originally been scored some years ago, or not scored at all, it may be worth scoring them with this new criteria to evaluate how they have performed. So with that, if we go on to the next slide, I'm happy to field any questions folks might have.
Thank you, Ethan. John.
Thanks, Jen, and Ethan, thanks for that presentation and all the presentations you did at the last meeting too. It's a lot of good work. I know that I just wanted some clarification on what the fill-in projects you mentioned. I know that in the past, like, if there's available funding, some MassDOT projects can get put onto the TIP, but what do you mean here? Could you explain what fill-in projects are?
So historically, the MPO has worked closely with the MBTA to solicit fill-in projects when there's funding availability in federal fiscal years 25 and 26. This year, just as with the Transit Transformation Program prioritizing applications from regional transit authorities, we have aggressively been working with our regional transit authorities, Metro West RTA, and also the Cape Ann Transportation Authority, to solicit projects from them as well as the MBTA, with the hope being that the RTAs, given the history of MBTA projects being funded, would also have a shot at this for their work too.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Brad.
Thank you, Chair. Less of a question, more of a comment. I just want to give a tip of the cap to MPO staff who have been working hard to identify municipal project proponents. Ethan, I remember all of the board meetings that we've gone through over the last year that you all as staff have said we need more proponents. We need folks throwing their hat in the ring, giving us good projects on both the design pilot, which is a new and novel program for this MPO, as well as for community connections, which is reaching a little bit more of a mature kind of year 3 in its evolution. And then of course our core investments. And I think it's worth this committee and our guests being reminded that this stuff doesn't just happen. We have so many communities in this MPO who have very few staff resources. And as a result, it is of critical importance that we've got the MPO staff in-house with the skill, the relationships, and the time to extend the hand and try to invite more folks into our processes. So I just wanted to give a shout out to staff and say, keep it coming. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Brad. Derek.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question, or 2 questions. First, and apologies if this is getting ahead of things, but is there a sense of the total cost of the design pilot projects that were submitted?
Very good question, Derek. So right now we are looking at about all in $18.4 million for all of the design projects that were requested. One of the important things to note there, however, is that different design stages were requested by different municipalities as well. So some municipalities only asked for enough to get to 25. The idea being that once they federalize their design early on, they could ask again to get to 100. That is an option. We may also look to fund design across multiple years of the TIP, especially because there's funding available in fiscal 26 as well. So lump sum, it is 18.4 million in fiscal 25. That may change if certain projects try to negotiate their costs, the MPO cost share lower, because there are some fairly sizable funding requests in there too. Or that may change if some municipalities believe they need even more funding to get to a later stage of design.
Got it. Great, thank you. And then second question, I saw there was a bicycle lane project submitted. I know we've talked in the past about, sort of the line between what might be a community connections project and what's a full like PRC approved MassDOT project. So I just wanted to confirm that any projects that kind of are in that category, and I guess any like community connections projects, we'll still discuss the feasibility of before decisions are made on the boards. Is that the case?
Yes, absolutely. It's still subject to the same rules that we have historically applied for procurement with MAPC and MassDOT for bike racks and the like as well. And also subject to right-of-way if necessary, though we don't believe that to be the case for this specific project.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Excuse me, Ethan, could you put the two questions up again and tell us what extent you want us to give you some feedback on them sooner rather than later?
Sure. So the first question was, to what extent do folks think that enough time is necessary to make a decision as to whether or not a project should be funded as a fill-in, namely? And then the second one is more just one that I think is more pertinent to the end of the readiness presentation, which is after this, which just is what I said in the last meeting and what the question Eric had asked about rescoring projects potentially that had cost increases or scope changes.
How long would it take you to rescore?
Good question. So rescoring a project is difficult as it would require a re-review of the latest functional design report or design submissions. It effectively takes about as long as scoring a new project. So follow-up question to that is, how long does it take to score a new project? It can take 2 weeks. It depends on the number of projects we score at once. We can obviously score multiple projects jointly, but there are certain activities that take longer than others under certain criteria. For example, crash rate calculations being one. Equity analyses are usually done in bulk with multiple projects all together at the same time through a script. The most time-consuming one for applicants to usually fill out and provide data for is the clean air analysis, which can take quite some time. That's mostly because of the amount of math that they have to do on their end for that.
So does it make sense then for us to reasonably assume that we could rescore projects in a way, that would, how can I phrase this? In a meaningful way to us. I mean, I know that's not a clear question. We're really trying to get at, and maybe I'll ask another set of questions. When we rescore, we'd be like comparing the scores to the current universe, right? I guess that's up to us. I mean, and maybe we have to discuss that ourselves. I mean, or are we rescoring that project simply against itself, or are we rescoring that project and then evaluating it, being against all other projects, being for a given year, or against the universe of projects which we're scoring? Do you have any? I shouldn't ask you that question. That's really a question for the board, or for us to consider. So I guess I just put that out there. It's like, to what end are we doing the rescoring? And then just kind of a thought experiment. Let's say the score comes out either significantly worse, compared to what it was before, controlling for the different way that we're scoring. And then what if when we look at all the other projects that we're going to select, it comes in really poorly? Are we really going to be willing to pull the plug on that project, or push it out a number of years, realizing that pushing out also has its inherent inflationary costs, which are probably more than 4%. That's it. That was a mouthful. I hope it made sense to something.
Thanks, Glenn. Derek.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess on that question, the second question about rescoring projects, given the 70-something million of over program now we see in fiscal year 2027, it may be helpful to think about scores of projects that are kind of recommended for that year, given kind of the competitiveness of that year in 2028 now, and see kind of what the priorities are. And that may inform discussions that, we have at MassDOT about, statewide programming versus MPO target funding, especially, Ken Miller's comment about, MassDOT projects that may have been picked up in the past that, maybe move back to the statewide program. So I think we, having a sense of the MPO scores for projects in the years that are competitive, right? Not the ones where there's big target holes or gaps, but the ones that have over programming estimated given readiness, I think would be the sort of priority for rescoring, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Eric, John.
Because I'm the MassDOT guy, so excuse me. What is the goal of rescoring from the community? Do they think that the priority will go higher? They don't think that their project is being considered as high of a priority as another project? That's kind of my question.
So, John, in that case, usually the request for rescoring actually comes from board members to the community, being that while their project may not have changed due to different fiscal circumstances, or let's say a project that was pitched to the MPO has had a big scope change, or the design isn't progressing as was seen, it provides members with an opportunity to reevaluate that project going forward with that new kind of reality in light. We also have a lot of projects on the tip that may have been on the tip for about 6 or 7 years now, and visions and goals have changed with the adoption of new LRTPs, and I think there's been 3 or 4 rewrites of criteria since that time as well.
Yeah. My other question is, well, my other follow-up to that is projects could be on the tip for a number of years, understood, requesting a rescoring. My concern is that communities have invested resources into a project that has been on the tip for a number of years, and is the consideration or the reconsideration for rescoring, does the project fall out of the priorities? And now how do you go back to your community and say, we spent this money and we have no return on it? And so I'm spitballing more than anything else. I'm just trying to understand because, I'm on the other side of it. I help to evaluate and recommend. And, my concern, having been a consultant for 25 plus years, is if a community I've been working with brought the project along for a number of years, and then a rescoring was recommended to assess the viability and priority of that project, it would be difficult if the project was scored lower, and then again you got to go back to the community and say that we spent resources that are not going to be essentially recovered, and we have no results for our efforts.
Yeah, thank you, John. I definitely agree with that, and I think that's going to be important as we approach the scenario discussion, because you are absolutely right. This does cut both ways, because what may be good for the target program is not good for the municipalities, and obviously we represent and work with the municipalities. It's also not really necessarily good for an asset management perspective either if we start dropping larger scale bridge projects out and other things there too, which I think goes without saying, but
Right.
I would just mention too that I do have another couple of slides on the readiness presentation after this. So if we do have questions about specific project readiness or scenario decision making, then we could potentially hold it till after that, because I do have a couple slides that weren't presented this morning that are more strategy oriented. So just noting that. But happy to field any other questions.
Thank you, Ethan.
Eric, if you want to go.
Yeah, Ethan, I'm sorry if you already mentioned this. How many? So the document that we created, sort of the the policy recommendation on cost changes, talks about projects that either go up by 25% or 2.5 million, I believe is what it says. How many, do you have a sense of how many projects that would be?
So we don't have any projects that have broken the $25 million cost increase.
No,
threshold.
25% or
Oh.
two or 2.5 million.
Okay, very good question. So almost every one of those, I believe, I don't have the number right in front of me, but I want to say it was 11 projects. Actually, no, I apologize. Let me get the number. So there were 11 projects with cost changes beyond 10%, 10 of which were increases there. That would likely capture more than 11 projects, because I believe there are a couple that may have seen $2.5 million cost increases just because their delay pushed them out to a 4 to 8% cost increase.
Ethan, your sound is
Yeah.
very low.
Yes.
Sorry, I think it's because my mic went below my head there.
That's right. That is
I
right.
was just saying that we have had, given that there are about 10 projects that have seen cost increases beyond 10%, that it is likely that once one also factors in the $2.5 million threshold as well there, I don't know the exact number, but we would also start to capture some projects that were delayed maybe 1 or 2 years that were larger scale and increased by 2.5 million as a result of that too. I think, for example, that Lynn's project, the Western Avenue project, while the cost didn't get a change because of a budget reevaluation, it changed by about 4 million just because of the inflation, because it was a large scale project. So it is a large number of projects. I think but my understanding is that it is a case by case basis by which projects are selected. So cases where we have projects that had very significant cost increases beyond, I know that we had a few that were above 50%, double digit millions. It's up to members to kind of pick the ones that they think they should pursue.
So I guess if the feeling is that there's just so many projects this cycle that it would be a lot, just maybe an overwhelming body of work to rescore so many projects, then maybe it makes sense to focus on the top, the top 5 or 10 projects to focus on. But I do think that I think there's value in hearing more about why some of these projects there's a Salem one. I think it's Boston Street. I think it'd be good if we could hear from Salem more about that. I understand that there are inflation issues, but I do think it'd be I think it's important for us to understand what's going on with some of these. And I look to other members here, but I'm also fine with staff looking at the list and saying, like, based on our expertise, we feel like these are the ones that would be really good to have folks come in on and have a conversation with them a little bit more, and maybe even do some rescoring at the very least to get to John's Bashard's question about, like, why rescore the project, what does that do? I do think that can help us understand why we might take an action on a certain project that's not so but that there's a reason behind it, why we would potentially push one project out further than another one, because I think that's what we're going to have to do with some of these is so there's going to be a ripple effect, right? Because we're going to push projects into, I forget what it was, which year had the 80 million deficit, but like we're going to have to then push some of those projects out first. So there's this ripple effect. And I think understanding how we're doing that, I think using the rescoring to inform some of that decision, I think makes sense.
Thank you, Eric. I'm gonna jump in real quick because I see Len and an iPhone user both have their hands up. But before calling on you, I just want to, because I know Ethan did have some more to share on readiness. So I wanted to quickly see if there was anything else related to the first item here on questions to consider. the latest date that we think it would be reasonable to receive fill-in projects. And maybe for this question, could we go back to the timeline? I guess Len and Dennis, do either of you have comments related to that item?
No, I don't. I would say, certainly as soon as possible. And I can wait until Ethan does the rest of the presentation and then come back to respond to things about rescoring. So thank you, Jen.
Appreciate your understanding on that. And
I'll take my
Dennis?
hand down.
Yeah, I can wait too if that's best.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. All right. I mean, I think. Does anyone have comments specifically on this? Kind of do we want to provide a hard or a like less drop dead, but just guidance on when we would want to receive any potential fill-in projects, whether those be from the RTAs, the MBTA, MassDOT, other municipalities. I imagine most of these would be from the state agencies, but.
Okay, well, we usually get to a meeting and we wish that we had information sooner, so let's have the information before that meeting. So I would say, maybe we can bring back the calendar, but let's say, mid-March. So we have a meeting in 1 week, maybe 2 weeks. So let's say by well, maybe we would want to have it by the first meeting in March. And if they can't do that, then we give them a break to our second meeting in March, and then that's really it. So anything beyond that just is going to be hard for us to consider it in a less pressured way.
Fun, yeah. Dennis, I wasn't sure if you newly raised your hand or if it was still raised from before. But yeah, I think unless I hear other comments, I think we can perhaps the advice of send it to us before the first meeting in March. Yeah, if that doesn't happen, then certainly by the second meeting. And then I guess maybe perhaps to have things posted for those meetings would be a 2 days beforehand. So perhaps that's the real deadline. John.
Thanks, Jen. I just had a question. So, the final scores are presented on March 7th, but Ethan, can you speak to what the timeline is after March 7th? Like I just need to get a sense of that so I can kind of actually respond to this question.
Yeah, good question. So March 7th, this is all dependent on when applicants are getting their scores in. Every applicant that we have a score for today, we think we can get a score finalized to present to members on March 7th. Those are those 30 projects that I mentioned. There are some projects that still need some more details, so that might delay it. On March 14th, when this committee meets next, based on the discussion we just had before this, we would then maybe be discussing how we want scenarios to look and account for those projects and potentially identify what projects might be priorities to fund in the scenarios discussed on March 21st. Then the week after that, after we have that in-person meeting where board members actually vote on what scenarios should be adopted or considered, or rather one scenario to adopt, and then we'll make some versions of that to reflect some of their priorities. We then have a meeting on March 28th to kind of go through projects there. Historically, what has happened is that after the first project, after the first scenario meeting, there may still be funding left on the table, as was the case last year. Sometimes fill-in projects come around then. I believe last year we had projects coming in at the end of March from Highway Division and from the MBTA there. One of the points of this question being that would we want them to come in if we are in March and we're still looking for some by March 14th? When do we kind of set a drop dead date by, for lack of a better term, to provide that level of information? Because again, part of the objective of this committee is to try to provide transparency as to the process and additional information in a more timely manner. So we want to make sure that board members aren't being asked to fund a project the day that they have seen it for the first time.
So on the 14th, you said that's when this committee will be going through some of the scenarios, correct?
Yes, we hope to have some scenarios ready for review there, or to at least provide feedback on before we present them formally at the following meeting. Because this committee does not vote on tip items, it
Yeah.
advises on them. It will inform what members vote on the following week.
Okay, so will the gaps in funding be known at the March 7th meeting or at this March 14th meeting when we discuss potential scenarios? Because I think that might inform when we want to have the deadline, because we did, like, if we're reaching out to folks, I would assume that they won't want to put the work in if they don't know if it's actually going to result in a project being seriously considered.
So we've already been reaching out to some municipalities on this front. I can tell you verbally that we have a good sense of where the gaps are today based on the readiness updates, in that knowing that there's about $20 million of design projects in fiscal 25 and 72 million available in that year, there's still a sizable chunk of money in that year. Now, we do think there are a couple of projects that might still have some cost increases and some things might change, but we generally have enough info to know that we're gonna need some projects in fiscal 25 and 6. In 9, that $51.19 million at the very end there, that is actually likely going to be eaten up by the 3 projects that we received applications for in the core application round. We've about $35 million of new construction projects coming in there. I did just want to give folks a heads up that we can go into more of this at the end if there's more kind of questions here, but my readiness update goes into a little bit more on the details and the specifics as to what the strategy will be around programming projects at those following meetings, just to kind of maybe answer a couple of questions up front about why these changes are happening and things of that nature as well.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Then I think having that information on hand, I think probably similar to what Len said, maybe having the March 7th or March 14th deadlines would be, I think, sounds feasible to me.
John, Eric.
Oh, I was gonna say, to me, like March 21st would be the absolutely deadline for getting any new projects to fill the gap in like 25 or 26. I agree, earlier is better. I just we would have to send the word out, ASAP on here on, getting MassDOT, the agencies, the T, others, just that would have to get sent out really, really soon for them to do the work of bringing things forward. But I think the 21st to me would be the absolute drop dead, because at least if we heard about it on the 21st, we could have more discussion at this meeting on the 28th, and then hear about it again on the 7th and make another, make a final vote.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah. And I do believe, as Ethan said, that I believe all the entities that are likely to be, potentially submitting these type of fill-in projects are aware to a degree of where there's going to be funding already. So hopefully they'll be able to work with those types of deadlines.
We have had conversations with all of them already.
All of them. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Ethan, and staff for getting us into that to a good place this year relative to others. Len, you're unmuted. Okay. All right. Any other comments on the kind of guidance timeline? Otherwise, I think we feel to have settled on kind of suggested and a drop dead. All right. Ethan, should we kick off into the...
Yeah, Aaron, if you could jump us a fair bit ahead. So my last presentation for today is a sort of redo with some subtractions and additions of this morning's readiness update. So to start again, for those that were not able to join us this morning, on the meeting calendar for this meeting is the TIP project readiness scenario spreadsheet for folks that want to follow along, see the projects that are they're recommended for delay, highlight in red, of high risk with their text in red, moderate risk is text in orange, new projects are any projects that have a blue highlight and are not factored at the bottom of that spreadsheet, just for folks that are running through it on their own screens. So, and thank you, Jen, for linking that spreadsheet in the chat for those who are interested. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'll also just reiterate real quick that, again, as I mentioned in the readiness update meeting this morning, this year we did not have any major changes in overall funding availability before accounting for program changes. We are generally looking at funding availability outright between 125 and a little over $160 million a year across the 5 years of the TIP. This is largely in line with what was present last year and is unchanged from that, so there's nothing too deep to go into there. And if we go on to the next slide, we have some bottom lines here really about what the funding availability is. So first off, I have a more blown up picture of this chart on the next slide, but the disclaimers of these numbers that I showed this morning and that I will show again here is that this factors in most of the delays for projects and most cost changes and inflation changes and any advanced construction programming in advance that we knew of as of February 8th. We have factored in a couple new developments since then that are also reflected on this table, but more will come over the next 2 months. We are also not factoring in any new projects as of yet that is subject to scenario discussions or if any new information comes in. We do know of at least 2 projects that may be seeing further cost increases, potentially in federal fiscal year 2025, and may be requesting MPO money to accommodate those cost increases. There also may be projects that try to move back on a delay to stay in their current programmed year. This is all subject to change. Bottom line is, on the next slide, that we have a lot of money. In the first 2 years of the TIP, the third and fourth year of the TIP, we have a significant deficit of about around $106 million in the negative. And we have $51.19 million in fiscal 29 for the new projects. So I'll break this out further if we go on the next slide. Let's talk about federal fiscal year 25 and 26. So these 2 years have very large amounts of unprogrammed funding. The main reason why this happened is that all of the delays that have hit with the TIP this year were predominantly found in federal fiscal year 2025. Many of the projects in 25 were delayed out to 27 and 8 even, not all into 26. And 26 mostly saw delays into 27 and 8 as well. One of the other factors that has significantly impacted this, and if we go on the next slide, this deficit in the third and fourth year is the fact that in addition to those delays, we also saw some very severe cost increases on some projects, in some cases increasing upwards of 75 to 100% greater due to design estimates that even if they were at 25% design when the MPO evaluated them, were pre-COVID design estimates there. This has functionally led to a deficit of over $106 million in those 2 years, and at this time, we are still looking for ways to potentially address that deficit, as was discussed earlier, whether or not projects should be reevaluated for funding in those years. And as I also mentioned in the board meeting this morning, this is not an abnormal thing happening to other MPOs across the state. Other MPOs are also experiencing these delays, and the statewide highway program also has a lot of projects here. So something I would like to mention, which I think is worth bearing, is that while the MPO has a deficit in 27 and 8, it is not necessarily the case that MassDOT may be able to fund it through their money. It's not as though that they don't also have fiscal constraint in those years. I'd also like to note too, and I think this is important to consider, that federal fiscal year 2029 is where most of the new projects will be funded. Previous discussions we've had about scoring have highlighted that this was also the year with the least amount of construction projects that the MPO has received in a very long time, at only 3 projects seeking construction funding. Those projects are all looking at money in federal fiscal year 2029 right now. They amount to about $35 million worth of construction projects, which is to say that while one of the objectives of scenario planning is to take our current obligations today and make sure that they are supported going forward with all of their various readiness needs and items there, it is worth considering that the 3 applicants that did provide a project this cycle may not, it may send a certain message to prospective applicants in future tip cycles if those projects are not funded because of certain delays out of 28 and 29 into those years. Just something I wanted to mention, not necessarily a stance that I have on this issue, but another factor as we look, consider that the tip is updated annually, and there will be a 26 to 30 tip that will also have more things changing and moving and new projects to consider a year from now. So if we go on to the next slide, this is a reiteration. I am not going to go back through this. I encourage folks who would like to learn more about any of the specific projects being delayed, flagged for risk, or that have cost increases to either view the recording of this morning's MPO board meeting, which will be posted on YouTube, or to ask specifically in the question and answer period after this presentation, or to email me directly if there's a very specific question that you may have that might be a little bit more long form. So if we just kind of jump ahead through these, I've really only listed them here in case folks want to go back to them once we hit Q&A. Might be several, Erin. We're going to stop back when we see the draft financial outlook at the very end again. So again, bottom line is that we are looking at a fairly difficult programming scenario that I think is unlike recent tip development scenarios where we not only have a very large amount of money that needs to be programmed to new projects, but we also have an unprecedented deficit of funding in other years, and the ability to swap between the years does not currently seem to be available to cover these gaps. We also, in a year with the lowest amount of applications we have seen, don't necessarily have too much money to fund both those new projects and any delays we might try to make out of 28 into 29 to support those. So some key considerations if we go on to the next slide. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a snapshot, and some of these items are going to change, and that MassDOT has witnessed similar outcomes too. These are not just unique to our region or necessarily municipally proposed projects either. While almost all of the projects that were delayed out of fiscal 2025 were municipally prioritized projects, a lot of the issues with regard to right-of-way and different permitting there are still subject or are still a factor in MassDOT design standards. MassDOT is also, in conjunction with the MPO, still evaluating the totality of the financial outcomes of these delays and the constraint. As was mentioned in a comment during this morning's MPO board meeting, the readiness comes first, and the financial implications of those readiness outcomes tend to come after to figure out what will come of that. The scope really defines what the scope of the individual projects that make up the program that is the tip define where the money can be allocated accordingly second. Staff are going to work with this committee and also other partners here to convey any new information we obtain as we obtain it, and also try to discuss the sources of these challenges to determine solutions. So let's talk about the sources of some of these challenges. If you can go on to the next slide. So the elephant in the room when it comes to talking about why we had so many projects get delayed is why are we seeing projects get delayed? In this morning's presentation, I went project by project about why each of them saw a delay, but there were recurring themes across a lot of them. Most of the projects that we're seeing delays on in the tip were either recommended for delay because they had difficulty submitting their right-of-way plans, or they were encountering unforeseen environmental or other permits. So in discussions with some of the experts on this over at MassDOT, there's one prevailing theory as to why this is happening. And again, this is a theory, this is not necessarily an answer. Right-of-way and permitting are a very complex process for most municipalities to navigate, and it appears that with a lot of the turnover in municipal level staff, including a lot of retirements during COVID, there is no longer as robust an institutional knowledge base for a lot of smaller communities when it comes to navigating these processes. The reason why federal funding, which is a major funding source for both the state and municipalities, is not specifically applied to right-of-way acquisition is because using federal funding for right-of-way makes it even more complex. What this also means is twofold. Not only is it more difficult for municipalities to navigate the right-of-way process administratively, but when they do attempt to undertake right-of-way acquisition, they are using local resources that would have otherwise paid their consultants to design the projects as well. So this is further strain. Basically, what we're really looking at here, I think, is an issue of local financial resources to acquire and manage right-of-way, and also a lot of institutional knowledge turnover for very complex and context-sensitive legal processes, especially when talking about hundreds of abutters in one given project, or a town that is trying to administer multiple projects at once. Again, this isn't an answer. These are just a couple theories that we've come up with. John, do you have a comment on that too?
Yeah, I wanted to, it's also the complexity of right of way and permitting that's changing. There's been some, with when a project impacts a property that is protected under Article 97 of the Constitution, EEA has recently, well, let's say we have in excess of 40 projects that are being delayed because of Article 97 land disposition. And it's because EEA is putting in some new procedures to secure that property. In the past, we would need to have legislation drafted by a local state rep or state senator on behalf of the community, and it would go through the legislature for the transfer of that land. EEA has modified that process. They want to upload the information to a portal. They're changing some of those processes, and a little of that is complicated or further complicated by retirements at the state level as well, that there's some new processes in place. We're all kind of learning them a little bit at the same time, and not everything has been fully vetted, but we are, assessing those risks, meeting individually with EEA and trying to elevate the concerns that we have on some of these projects so we can make it smoother. On the permitting side, at least locally, when we're dealing with DEP on permitting, they have new regulations which are currently out for review that may further impact project delivery processes with, they're trying to acquire, look at acquisition of more property to mitigate the effects of stormwater and, as a result of climate change, and trying to reduce the total demand load on water bodies within the Commonwealth. So there are some considerations on the permitting side that are also being evaluated. So I don't want to only put it on the community and on, the consultants and DOT trying to execute this stuff. It's also the agencies are changing. They're adding a little bit of process, and the uncertainties in complexities in those processes causing some of that delay as well. Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's very important to consider as well here, because as I'll also mention on the next slide, if we can jump to that, circumstances for both project scopes and permitting environments are also changing. So the second issue that we've highlighted is that many projects that were also recommended for delay weren't meeting their design submission deadlines either, or submissions required revision, possibly due to lack of sufficient level of detail in right-of-way plans, as one example, or new considerations for different permits. Designs and scopes of work for projects will change over time, especially because the purpose of design is to try to determine how a project will take shape. And also, again, as John mentioned, this isn't all to put it on one specific party here. Some of these theories may either complement or contradict each other. One item that I know has come up for some projects is that varying consultants may have different capacity on their side or different levels of familiarity with MassDOT requirements. If, for example, you are using an out-of-state consultant that doesn't have a lot of MassDOT contracts or is new to the operation, and some consultants have also recently restructured either through mergers or acquisitions or different changes there too. Again, not putting this all on the consultants so much as just mentioning that they are another party that is also involved in navigating these processes. And then again, the other factor that has come up with several projects is town meeting. The town meeting schedule does not necessarily follow a federal fiscal year schedule. Often it follows a state fiscal year schedule. So one of the other notions being that when design funding costs require a town meeting approval to move forward, if those approvals don't move forward on the timeline as seen, that may delay a project, especially if the state fiscal year and the federal fiscal years don't quite line up exactly for those communities. Some communities have also expressed that they don't necessarily get enough lead time by MPO staff to know when they should appropriate funding for projects, as was the case we've seen when we were trying to set up the design pilot as well. And again, local and state and consulting capacities can also be factors there too. Len, do you have a question?
Just quickly, I want to say towns can always have special town meetings. So So that shouldn't really be a big factor. Just saying, if they want it badly enough, they can have a special town meeting and get it done,
Good point.
So, and then I will have a question later on, but I mean, it's really regarding the right of way issue. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then to the matter of cost too, because that's the other factor. Again, I've got one. This is my last content slide after this one, and then I've got a couple questions that I'll pitch. But one more slide, please. Right. Why are costs increasing? So, elephant in the room, as it comes up very frequently for most of these, is inflation. A lot of projects that have a very slow design excuse me, very slow progress towards advancing their design also tend to have older cost estimates. As noted, some of the projects that saw the greatest percentage cost increases were based on estimates that came from 2019 and early 2020. I mention this because I know that earlier I had alluded to the project cost change policies that the MPO had adopted. A lot of the projects that we saw that had all these cost increases had 25% designs when they were programmed in the tip. It was also a jump to a 75% that had notified staff of that increase, which is not to say that maybe we should be funding projects only when they're at 75. That is not it. It's also just worth noting that there isn't really a silver bullet level of maturity in a project's design where we can expect project costs to remain fixed. As mentioned also with regard to projects being delayed, permit needs that emerge during a project may require a change in project scope, which could be requiring that additional stormwater mitigation be done on site, soil disposal, different bedrock items. I know that a lot of the amendments we've seen recently have seen cost increases because of soil disposal mitigation activities, addition of things like wildlife crossings, bridge widening to incorporate shared use paths on bridge structures, or widening of culverts. One of the projects we received an application for this year had actually applied last year and is not yet at 25% design because a culvert in the project area is now being widened to about I want to say 19-foot bridge structure. So there are some fairly sizable changes that will also come as a project continues its design lifespan, and that will necessarily will typically, I should say, require a cost change. The other unfortunate reality too is that if a project is getting delayed, the condition of the asset is getting worse over time unless there are interim preservation contracts being put out or other kinds of maintenance activities being done. That basically means that not only are you going to see more inflation as a project gets delayed, but also the bridges and the roads that are being sought to fix are going to get worse. That may mean that instead of a thin overlay contract that you might want to administer or a roadway reclamation, it is a full depth reconstruction of the roadway, as items may change there. So with that, I've got a couple more questions to consider. They don't necessarily need to be answered here, but just some of the ones that I've been pondering as part of navigating some of these challenges. Generally speaking, are there very specific projects that were highlighted either this morning or that we could go back to in this discussion today that members may have questions or might want more information for? And if you are looking for more information, I can create a list and start talking to towns to get it. They don't necessarily need to come to the committee if you don't think that's necessary. How does the federal fiscal year 25 funding availability we have, this is a tricky one, impact our project design pilot funding? We've had this come up in a couple of meetings now. We had programmed $4 million to fund projects there. We received about 18.4 million in request. How many and how much design funding should be programmed? Because while the money is available, do we want to program so many that we have many projects seeking funding in outer year future tip cycles when we might have a lot of fiscal constraint? That relates to that $51 million for the 3 projects that I mentioned earlier, where there's not exactly too much to go around for the people that are applying today. Not to say that we shouldn't still allocate that, but it's another factor to consider, in addition to other factors that we may use to weigh projects against one another. And then I also sort of pitched here that should we also look to create, using the fiscal 26 availability, a second round of this pilot as well? Because while we don't yet know the results of the first, we do have the money to do so to be ready for the 26 and 30 tip cycle. We also, as I mentioned right there, I think I just kind of answered that question, is we have about $35 million of those new construction projects going against $50 million available in fiscal 29. We usually try to keep around $15 to $20 million in that last year of the tip, just in case something happens there, which is a traditional thing, I believe, from prior tip cycles. Again, what does that mean for the project pipeline if we don't have a lot of funding available to us today to support what few new projects we have? How much do we want to widen that up? Because we may end up having too many projects coming in and turning a lot of folks away. If we turn away a lot of projects that are advancing their designs, what does that mean for how we engage with our communities and municipalities there? The other thing I would just like to mention too is that that is related, I think, to long-term discussions about the long-range transportation plan too, which I'm happy to kind of field questions on if folks want, but it's a rabbit hole we could end up going down. So fair warning. And again, many of the projects that were also delayed, while I mentioned that some that saw cost increases went from 25% to 75%, a lot of the ones that were recommended for delay have been on the tip for a couple of cycles now and still don't yet have an approved 25%. But we're still seeing really low application volumes for the tip, and many of the projects that we received applications for this year are still trying to get an approved 25% design themselves. So how firm should that 25% design guideline be, recognizing that we have challenges with project readiness for the projects we have today, but also recognizing that we don't have a whole lot of projects seeking that funding right now. Again, not saying that there's any particular side that I think is correct, but more just saying that I think that is a major challenge strategically for the tip that is worth considering. So with that, happy to field any questions if we want to keep this up here or go to the next slide.
Ethan, was your next slide?
It just says discussion on it.
Oh, it just says discussion. Okay, cool, great. Okay, thanks for the clarifying question there. Yeah, thank you so much. I have a lot of questions. I think one thing I just wanted to bring up, because I in the MPO meeting this morning, you'd noted that it seems quite unlikely MassDOT would be able to do like a kind of swap type scenario due to the number of projects that they also have that are delayed in a similar way to ours. And you also have mentioned that it seems unlikely we're able to move money between fiscal years. I think one thing, given the frequency with which this type of challenge happens, perhaps not to this degree, I think it would be worth asking our federal and state partners to really understand the degree that we cannot do that, like moving of funding and investigate, just to be very to understand when such a thing might happen, or if it absolutely cannot happen ever. So to know whether that's a tool at our disposal or not. I don't want that to like take away from further discussion of what we should do in the event that likely we are working within fiscal constraint in each year, but to bring it up. All right, I think Derek was the first hand I saw.
All right, and yeah, just to speak to that, I mean, that's definitely something we can follow up on and try to get clarity on with our federal partners and with David and others to get some firm response on. But what I was going to speak to the second question here on design funding, just so folks are kind of clear on the process. The design funding, the way it kind of works is that there does need to be a contract set up with MassDOT. Because it's federal funding, in the past, and I believe in the future, just the way it kind of flows is we do have to serve as a pass-through. And so there's a contract between MassDOT and the municipality to make the design funding available. And so depending on the amount of applications that are funded, I would just want to make sure, again, just kind of bringing that back to folks and our highway division in particular. And John, I know, there's a contracts office in highway division that would be dealing with this. And I just want to make sure that, there is administrative capacity to fund, a much higher amount of design work than maybe they would be used to handling. So just wanted to throw that out there for consideration to make sure, Ethan, that we're coordinating on any decisions that are made before things go out. So just wanted to throw that out there as one consideration, the administrative sort of issues associated with the design funding.
Yeah, and to follow up with that too, Derek, what we're also cognizant of, and I appreciate you mentioning that because I did overlook that in this discussion, is project management capacity, not only at the local level, but also at MassDOT too. Just making sure there's enough project managers to go around for all of this work is also going to be important to make sure that we can all stay on track here. It's not just funding. That's the only consideration to have as we're trying to select who goes forward.
Right. No, absolutely. Thank you.
Eric and Ethan, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. So on the first, I'm just gonna tick through these to give you my input. On the first question about specific projects, I think there were, and I appreciate having folks from Hingham be able to talk a little bit about the 3A project. I think we've heard more about that one. I think the Salem project was the other one that went up really high in cost. I think getting more information, either you speaking with them, Ethan, or having them come here and talk about, and we funded a number of projects in Salem in the past, and I know they do a really good job. I know they have experience with this, so I'm sure there are some really legitimate issues. Would like to just hear more about that. Again, I think if there are some others that are very big cost increases, like more than $10 million, dollars, I think it would be really good for us to hear more about what the reason is there. In terms of the design funding, yeah, you raise, an interesting sort of challenge, which is we could potentially fund all the design projects, right? But then we're going to have this problem in the outer years of the TIP because we have some deficits in 27 and 28, and so presumably we're going to be pushing some of those projects into 29. And it seems like this problem is not going away. Like this whole situation of projects not being ready or cost increases, and so this is just a trend. And yeah, we could have a lot of projects that we give design funds to, but then we don't actually have funds for to program them. In some ways, I'd be interested to hear what municipalities think. I mean, in part of me feels like, well, maybe we don't have a strong pipeline of projects. Okay, let's try to get more projects in the pipeline. And I know it's frustrating from cities and towns if they get projects designed, but then there's not a slot for them to go in. But I don't know. Maybe that's a good problem to have. I don't know. I'd be really interested in feedback from others about that, because I see it both ways, which is, well, we should just be more cautious then and not commit to the design funding, which really then is that we're committing to the construction funds. I'd be actually interested in kind of like John's perspective on that. But I think it is clear that we will likely be shifting a lot of projects, right, from 27 and 28 into 29. I think that's safe to say.
I think that could potentially be an outcome of this, yes.
And then, yes, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's a lot of different possibilities. I know some towns have said that they may be able to stay in 26 rather than go to 27. But that is easier. That's usually difficult to accomplish, especially at this stage of TIP development, because again, we also only have 2 months before we have a draft TIP go out. So that's one of the other tricky realities.
Okay, and then on your last point about the 25% design, so what we had said years ago was we'd like to only program projects that are like at 25% design, because we have a much better handle on what the project is and the cost and things like that. But we really haven't been doing that, right? Like because of the pipeline of projects issues, we have been programming lots of projects way before the 25% design. So it feels like that's not even a rule we have anymore. Is that right?
I mean, from where I think what we did last year was that the MPO board gave priority to any project that had a 25%, and then with the funding that was remaining, the non-25% projects were considered. I believe that was a leading factor into why one of the projects seeking funding this year was not funded last year. but functionally there are still projects that got on the tip even though they weren't at a MassDOT approved 25% design. I think the other issue being that sometimes being at 25%, again, this is a rabbit hole, but can be subjective, which is to say that some municipalities, when they have a 25% design plan that they may have done internally or with a consultant, they may say that makes them eligible. If MassDOT agrees with that, that's a different matter, but that also takes a lot more time to get done. So that's also kind of been one of the difficult subjects to broach. Last year, almost every project we received an application for had some kind of 25% design, but it was only one that actually had one that MassDOT had in hand as 25% approved.
Okay. Thanks.
I'll just also mention too that this year we have 4 projects for construction and one has a 75% design and the other 3 have designs but are in the same boat where they aren't MassDOT approved 25%.
Glenn,
Yeah, well, I think they should be MassDOT approved. We should take the subjectivity out of it, reduce as much as possible. I have a question and then just a statement about rescoring. The question is about right of ways. For those of you who have been around, would it be feasible, you think, to make it such that the municipalities have to have the right of way issues settled before they bring it to us, or we can just make it part of the scoring that if you don't have your right of way scheduled settled, your score gets dinged heavily. Is that reasonable, John Shard?
I don't know if that's really reasonable,
Okay.
Len. It's
Okay. All right, I'll take a
no,
I'll
no,
take a
it-
note.
it-
I'll
no,
take a
no,
note on
I-
that just because I want to
No,
go
I
to
just
my
want to say
last
that
point.
because right of way can be a lengthy process.
Yeah.
Cities are able to do it differently than towns. Towns have
Yeah.
to go to town meeting. City generally has to go to city council and mayor. So
Yeah.
there can be a more a shorter time frame for cities and towns, for cities versus towns.
Well, it's just
So
increasing uncertainty. Then you're making the case that if this guy extend the timeline in an uncertain way, then
right.
then that puts us at risk. So we shouldn't take that risk on, unless we
Right.
price it in.
I think one area that we try to focus on, Len, at MassDOT is accepted or approved right of way.
Yeah.
That means that the plans have been sufficiently prepared,
Yeah.
and my team has agreed with the process that they've developed to this point. And when they're approved or accepted, and it's approved at for state action and accepted for state action and approved for municipal action, that I'm just trying to give you the distinction, then we consider that to be a higher level of approval than they've just submitted right-of-way plans. It's because it's been reviewed, they've tied down the layout, the areas we're in reasonable agreement of the areas that are needed for the project. And then because once you have approved or accepted, it still could be 6 months to a year to complete appraisals, payments, and things like that. But again, approved or accepted is better than submitted and we're not sure yet. You know what I mean?
Just because it's time to show, I just want to get in one other comment.
Yeah.
And that is that when it comes to rescoring, I think we should rescore the project against itself, because essentially, whether we do it officially or not, we're doing a cost benefit analysis. We're saying, based on your score and how much you cost, this is a benefit that you accrue. If your costs go up significantly, then your CBA may very well change. Unless the scope of your project changes, in which case, if your cost goes up because your scope has changed, then maybe your CBA is still good. So that's how we should rescore. But most importantly, we should rescore and determine how we're going to reevaluate in a standardized way so that no community feels that they're being favored or disfavored based on subjectivity. We should have a hard and fast rule by which we determine that we're going to rescore. And if we break that rule, we have to have very clear and transparent reasons for breaking that rule. That's it. Thank you.
Glenn, Brad.
Thanks, Chair. Kind of quick parting thought here since we're at time. I think it's important that we as a committee and we as guests and project proponents take a quick step back here, because otherwise we might despair. This is a really hard year This is the hardest year in the modern era. And I want to remind all of us that this committee was not established as like a firefighting brigade. We were not pulled together to save the target funds in this tip cycle. We were pulled together because every year this MPO has identified structural barriers, has identified strange loopholes and other idiosyncrasies of federal funding and the realities of project delivery that cause issues with cash flow, that cause frustrations for project proponents, for our state and federal agency partners. We are here to play the long game and to improve this MPO's process over multiple tip cycles, not just this one acute pressure point that we are dealing with right now. So as you reflect on your notes, folks, please do think about that long game. We're going to have a hard slog over these next 8 weeks together, but the work that we do has to translate beyond those 8 weeks in this tip cycle. Nice job, Chair. Thank you.
Really helpful reminder. Some great closing thoughts, unless though I did see some hands that were raised earlier, and I will note that we are at time. At the same time, if I'm able to stay on, I know Ethan's able to stay on a few more minutes if anyone who hasn't had a chance to say or respond to these questions has a chance to do so. In that case, I am sure we will continue this discussion or versions of it over the next few months. And yes, thank you, Ethan. I will also put my email in the chat as well. With that, is there a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Right.
Leonard.
Thank you,
Chair, I'll
Len.
second that motion.
Thank you, Brad. Right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope a relaxing rest of your afternoon. Thank you for staying with us so long. And
Thanks all.
we'll see.
Appreciate the
Take care.
discussion.
Yeah, same here.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.